Linda Cross's quiet life was shattered when her new neighbor, Jonathan Hale, demanded access to her private driveway, claiming it was community property. Arrogant and calculating, Jonathan launched a campaign of harassment, blocking her access, spreading lies, and filing false complaints to break her will. But Linda wasn't about to let him win. With ironclad evidence and a courtroom showdown, she fought back in a way that left Jonathan humiliated and justice fully restored. But just wait until you hear how this battle ended and why karma hit harder than anyone expected. Linda Cross had always cherished the peace and quiet of her suburban neighborhood in the outskirts of Chicago. After dedicating 4 decades to social work, she finally found solace in her charming home, a place filled with memories of her late husband, Tom. The driveway where they once parked their first car, the garden with his favorite hydrangeas. Everything about this home felt sacred. It was her sanctuary. But that peaceful world was shattered one hot June evening. Linda was watering her garden when a sharp knock echoed through the house. She opened the door to find a tall man standing stiffly on her porch. He wore an expensive blazer, dark sunglasses, and the expression of someone used to getting his way. She recognized him as the new neighbor who had recently moved into the house next door. Without waiting for an invitation, he spoke in a curt, authoritative voice. "I need you to stop parking your car on your side of the driveway. That's community property." Linda blinked, baffled. Did she mishear him? The driveway? Community property? She stood there for a moment, processing the absurdity of what he just said. "I'm sorry, I think you might be mistaken," she said, her voice calm but uncertain. "No mistake," the man cut in, crossing his arms. "Jonathan Hale, your neighbor. The previous owners allowed shared use of that part of the driveway. I expect the same arrangement." Linda felt her pulse quicken. What was this nonsense? The driveway was part of her property. She had the deed and every legal document to prove it. Still, she tried to remain diplomatic. "Well, Mr. Hale," she began carefully, "I'm afraid that's not how things work. This driveway is—" "I don't care about your paperwork," he interrupted, his tone turning colder. "If you keep parking there, I'll file a complaint with the city. And if necessary, I'll take this to court." He stared her down for a moment, then turned abruptly and walked away, leaving her stunned. Linda stood frozen on the threshold, gripping the doorframe. The audacity. She had lived in this house for over 30 years, and now this arrogant newcomer thought he could rewrite history? Her mind raced with questions. What gave this man the right to dictate where she could park on her own property? Who did he think he was? She glanced over at his house, modern, imposing, and suddenly ominous. In that moment, Linda knew one thing for certain. Jonathan Hale wasn't going to stop at idle threats. He was going to war, and like it or not, she would have to fight back. Jonathan Hale wasted no time turning their dispute into a full-scale campaign of harassment. It began with minor provocations. One morning, Linda stepped outside and found bright orange traffic cones lined up across the entrance to her driveway, blocking access to her car. She moved them without a word, thinking it was a one-off act of spite. But the following day, Hale parked his oversized SUV so that it partially encroached onto her property, making it nearly impossible for her to maneuver out without risking a scratch. Each small act was annoyingly precise, designed to irritate but not overtly break the law. Then came the noise complaints. Late one night, Linda heard a loud knock on her door. 2 officers stood on her porch, responding to a report of disturbing noise coming from her property. Linda was stunned. She'd spent the evening quietly watching TV and had barely spoken a word since sundown. The officers, polite but skeptical, took her explanation, but she could see it in their eyes. This was now on her record. Hale's strategy was clear: death by 1,000 paper cuts. The gossip followed soon after. The neighborhood, once a warm and welcoming community, began to feel hostile and cold. Neighbors who used to wave and chat now glanced at her with a mix of curiosity and wariness. Linda overheard snippets of conversations wherever she went. "Did you see what Hale posted about her on Nextdoor?" "I don't know. She always seemed a bit territorial." "Yeah, he says she's been making his life hell since he moved in." Linda's stomach churned as the rumors grew. She'd spent years building trust in this community, and now it was unraveling thanks to one manipulative man. Hale, it seemed, had a knack for playing both victim and charming newcomer. He painted himself as the reasonable one, someone who only wanted to cooperate, while subtly portraying Linda as a stubborn old woman clinging to outdated claims. The injustice of it all ate at her. Night after night, Linda lay awake, gritting her teeth in frustration. She couldn't understand how someone could be so ruthless, so intent on controlling a part of her life that had nothing to do with him. What made it worse was how effortlessly he seemed to manipulate others. But Linda was not one to cower in defeat. She had faced her share of bullies in her social work career and knew how to stand her ground. This time would be no different. By dawn, she made her decision. She was going to fight back. The first step was hiring Mike Peterson, a seasoned attorney with a reputation for taking on complex property cases. Linda met with him in a small, sunlit office filled with case files and legal texts. Mike listened attentively as she explained her situation, occasionally jotting notes and nodding in understanding. By the end of their meeting, they had a plan: gather every piece of documentation proving her ownership of the driveway, deeds, boundary surveys, and records dating back decades. But as the legal team began piecing the case together, darker truths came to light. Hale wasn't just an entitled neighbor with a personal vendetta. He had been quietly rallying support from others, spreading misinformation to strengthen his position. Some of the neighbors Linda thought she could trust had started siding with him. He'd charmed them with friendly smiles and persuasive stories, portraying Linda as unreasonable and unwilling to compromise. He was using his influence to reshape the narrative in his favor. Linda felt sick to her core. It was infuriating to watch people fall for his lies, but this only steeled her resolve. If Jonathan Hale wanted a war, he was going to get one. What he didn't realize was that Linda Cross wasn't just fighting for her driveway. She was fighting for her dignity, her peace of mind, and the home she had built with love and sacrifice over the years. This was her battle to win. The courtroom was tense from the moment proceedings began. Linda sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across the room, Jonathan Hale lounged with a smug expression, his high-priced attorney whispering in his ear. The battle lines were drawn, and Linda knew this wasn't going to be an easy fight. Jonathan was determined to paint her as irrational, even delusional. He had come prepared to twist every fact against her. From the very first session, Jonathan's lawyer launched into a series of insinuations. He claimed that Linda had misinterpreted property records, that the previous owners had willingly allowed access to the driveway, and that she was now unreasonably revoking what had supposedly been a long-standing agreement. Jonathan nodded theatrically with every point, his performance aimed as much at the judge as at the spectators in the courtroom. "Tate, Mrs. Cross has a history of being difficult with her neighbors," Jonathan's attorney declared at one point, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "This is simply another example of her unwillingness to cooperate." Linda's heart pounded in her chest. Difficult? How dare they? She had spent years being a good neighbor, offering help and kindness to everyone around her. The nerve of these people to stand here and twist the truth in front of a judge. Rage simmered beneath her calm exterior, and for the first time in her life, Linda understood what true fury felt like. But Mike Peterson, her attorney, was unfazed. He stood confidently and countered every accusation with facts. Piece by piece, he dismantled their narrative, presenting official records that clearly defined the property boundaries. Yet, Jonathan's side fought back with deflections and half-truths, trying to muddy the waters. Then came the turning point. "Your Honor," Mike announced as he pulled out a thick folder, "I'd like to present Exhibit A, a legally binding property agreement signed by the previous owners of both properties. It not only confirms the boundary lines, but explicitly states that the section of the driveway in question is under the full ownership of Mrs. Cross. This document predates Mr. Hale's acquisition of his property and overrides any verbal claims he might suggest." The courtroom fell silent as the judge examined the papers. Linda held her breath. Jonathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his smug facade beginning to crack. The judge took his time, flipping through the pages and nodding slowly. When he finally looked up, his expression was firm and unyielding. "Mr. Hale," the judge said, his voice echoing across the room, "the evidence is clear. Your claim has no legal standing. Your complaint is hereby dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, due to the harassment Mrs. Cross has endured, I am issuing a restraining order. You are prohibited from approaching her property or engaging in any further disruptive behavior." Linda exhaled sharply, her hands trembling from the adrenaline. She watched as Jonathan's face drained of color. His attorney whispered furiously in his ear, but it was too late. The decision was final, and there was no escaping it. Jonathan's expression shifted from shock to thinly veiled rage, but he was powerless now. He had played every dirty trick in the book, and he had lost. The court had seen through his lies and manipulation, siding firmly with Linda. As he stood to leave, his shoulders slumped ever so slightly, the weight of defeat settling over him. For Linda, it was more than just a legal victory. It was a triumph of justice over cruelty. She had fought for her dignity, her peace, and her home, and she had won. Finally, she could breathe again, knowing that the nightmare Jonathan Hale had brought into her life was over. After the court victory, Linda Cross didn't just reclaim her driveway, she reclaimed her peace of mind and her rightful place in the neighborhood. The ripple effects of the trial spread quickly, and the image Jonathan Hale had so carefully constructed began to crumble. Word got around about the judge's ruling and the restraining order. Neighbors who had once been charmed by Jonathan's smooth words and expensive suits suddenly saw him for who he truly was, a manipulative bully. At first, Jonathan tried to save face, offering half-hearted smiles and casual greetings as if nothing had happened. But people weren't buying it anymore. Conversation stopped when he entered a room. Invitations to barbecues and block parties mysteriously dried up. Even those who had once supported him began to distance themselves. One neighbor, Mrs. Daly, who had previously been friendly with him, didn't mince words when confronted at the local market. "After what you did to Linda, Jonathan, I don't think anyone here trusts you anymore," she said coldly. "We don't need people like you stirring up trouble." It wasn't long before Jonathan became a pariah in the neighborhood. Rumors about his failed court case and vindictive behavior spread like wildfire through community message boards and group chats. The very social networks he had once weaponized against Linda now turned against him. His name became synonymous with deceit and pettiness. Adding insult to injury, the local municipal council ruled that Jonathan had to reimburse Linda for all her legal expenses. It was a hefty sum, one he clearly hadn't anticipated. Linda knew he hated every penny of it, but that wasn't her concern. Justice had been served. For the first time in what felt like forever, Linda could relax. The early mornings filled with anxiety and sleepless nights of racing thoughts were over. No more threats, no more harassment, no more paranoia about what her neighbor might do next. She took pleasure in the little things again, tending to her hydrangeas, sipping coffee on her porch, and chatting with neighbors who now greeted her warmly and apologized for ever doubting her. She didn't dwell on revenge or Jonathan's downfall. That wasn't who she was. Instead, she reveled in the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing the truth had prevailed. Her home, her sanctuary, was once again a place of safety and comfort. And now, the neighborhood seemed to rally around her, as if recognizing how much she had endured and triumphed over. Linda often smiled to herself as she looked out over her yard. Jonathan still lived next door, but he was no longer a threat. His power had been stripped away, leaving him to wallow in his own disgrace. As for Linda, she was free to move forward without fear. Justice had been restored, and everyone in the neighborhood understood one undeniable fact: you don't mess with Linda Cross.